The observation glass still carries faint streaks from the last interior cleaning cycle. Under the deck lighting, they almost disappear, but when the ship rotates a few degrees, the Milky Way catches across the surface again, and every mark becomes visible for a moment before fading back into the reflection of the room. Most of the crew are already strapped into their acceleration couches below the observation level. Only a few people still move through the upper deck corridors now. A technician kneels beside an open maintenance panel near the rear bulkhead, tightening something by hand instead of using the powered tool clipped beside him. Someone farther down the corridor is reading checklist confirmations aloud at a pace that barely rises above the ventilation system. The voice flattens slightly every few sentences as the transmission passes through different sections of the ship. Outside the glass, the Orion arm remains dense enough to feel familiar. The brighter dust lanes still divide the sky into recognizable dark rivers. Dense star fields overlap behind them in layers thick enough that the empty spaces almost disappear entirely. From Earth, most people never realize how uneven the galaxy actually looks. The atmosphere smooths the structure from the ground. Out here, the shape becomes harder, sharper. The central band no longer resembles distant light scattered across darkness. It looks accumulated, packed together. In some regions, the density becomes high enough that the background stops feeling empty at all. And for the first time since departure preparations began, the galaxy no longer feels overhead. It feels positioned. The ship has not begun full departure burn yet. It is only drifting beyond the outer traffic lanes while orbital authorities clear the final outbound sequence. Small maneuvering thrusters fire every few minutes underneath the hull. The corrections are gentle enough that coffee inside unsecured cups barely ripples when they happen. A cooling pump somewhere beneath the deck keeps cycling unevenly. 3 short vibrations. Then silence. Then the same pattern again. Nobody comments on it. The observation deck lights dim automatically as the ship rotates farther from the sun. Reflections thin across the glass. More of the galaxy becomes visible. For a while, nothing changes except orientation. The stars move slowly enough that the motion only becomes noticeable after looking away for several seconds. One of the navigation overlays continues drawing transparent alignment lines across the glass, matching known pulsars against the ship's outbound heading. The system refreshes continuously, even though the alignment has remained stable for over an hour. A procedural habit. The computer keeps checking because orientation matters differently once local reference points start thinning out. The solar system still exists directly behind the ship, though from the observation deck, it no longer feels central enough to dominate the sky. The sun has already compressed into something visually ordinary. Bright, but no longer overwhelming. Several crew members pass the rear ports without looking at it anymore. People adapt quickly when systems remain stable. The checklist confirmations continue through the overhead speakers. Thermal control stable. Exterior antenna lock stable. Outbound drift vector stable. The phrases repeat so many times they begin sounding less like announcements and more like background machinery. Someone leaves a pair of gloves on the observation rail near the glass. One finger lifts slightly each time the deck vibration changes. Outside, the visible thickness of the galaxy continues wrapping across nearly half the sky. From Earth, it always feels surrounding, permanent. Even people who never study astronomy carry the unconscious assumption that the stars belong overhead. That orientation arrives naturally from looking upward long enough. But the navigation display near the forward window now labels the galaxy itself as a directional object. Port side. Relative bearing adjustment required in 18 minutes. The wording feels wrong the first time it appears. Not emotionally wrong. Procedurally wrong. like hearing weather described as cargo movement. The galaxy remains enormous outside the ship, but the onboard systems have already started treating it as external scenery instead of environmental containment. A crew member finally sits near the forward glass with a sealed drink pouch resting against one knee. He watches the alignment markers drift across the denser star fields while manually confirming the same calculations the ship completed earlier. Not because the computer needs help. Mostly because long departures create repetitive behaviors people trust more than automation. The ship rotates another few degrees. The brighter central regions slide lower across the observation glass. For a moment, the Milky Way no longer surrounds the deck evenly. Most of the visible density now occupies only one side of the forward view, while the opposite side opens into thinner regions where individual stars separate farther apart from each other. The imbalance is subtle at first, then structurally obvious. Nobody says anything when it happens. One of the crew members simply stops reading the checklist midway through a sentence. The silence lasts maybe 4 seconds before the transmission resumes again. Out beyond the dense regions, the sky already behaves differently. Navigation markers spread wider apart. The tracking overlays require larger search areas between confirmed reference points. Small automatic corrections begin appearing more frequently across the ship's orientation system. The stars are still everywhere, just no longer arranged around the observer equally. The distinction matters more than expected. The machine recognized the imbalance before the crew fully processed it. A soft vibration passes through the deck as the primary engines begin entering warm cycle preparation. Somewhere below the observation level, locking clamps retract one after another through the hull in slow mechanical sequence. The sound travels upward through the ship like distant metal doors opening inside a large building at night. Outside the glass, the Orion arm continues rotating silently. Dense, structured, still familiar enough to resemble home, but now visibly located somewhere specific instead of everywhere at once. The alignment display refreshes again across the window. For a second, the navigation lines fail to resolve cleanly against the star field before stabilizing a moment later. Then the outbound timer reaches 0 and quietly disappears from the screen. The wireframe grid continues rotating slowly across the forward display even after the ship finishes its outbound correction burn. Thin blue alignment lines pass over the star field one after another, pausing briefly whenever the system confirms a known pulsar position. Small confirmation tones continue sounding through the navigation deck at uneven intervals. Most are quiet enough that nobody reacts to them anymore. A navigation officer sits with one shoe half unlaced beneath the console while comparing automated trajectory calculations against an older manual reference table clipped beside the screen. The paper copy still exists because deep navigation systems are built through overlapping forms of trust. Digital maps fail differently than printed coordinates do. Long-distance crews learn to rely on redundancy more than certainty. The ship no longer accelerates continuously now. Most of the motion comes from slow orientation adjustments as the guidance systems refine the outbound trajectory against increasingly distant reference points. Every few minutes, the entire starfield drifts slightly sideways across the forward observation windows while the internal gyroscopes compensate. The movement is smooth enough that people mostly notice it through secondary effects. A drink pouch rolling a few centimeters across a console surface. Loose fabric tightening against a restraint strap. The faint sound of unsecured equipment shifting somewhere behind a maintenance wall. Outside the ship, the denser regions of the Milky Way remain visible mostly along the left side of the forward view. The thinner star fields ahead feel less structured now. Not empty, just less cooperative. The navigation overlays compensate immediately. Additional wireframe layers appear across the forward glass, constructing invisible geometric anchors between distant pulsars the human eye would never naturally connect together. Some of the points blink softly as the system recalculates timing drift caused by the ship's changing position. Most people imagine space navigation as movement between objects. In practice, it behaves more like maintaining agreement between clocks. A technician wipes condensation from the edge of one monitor with the sleeve of a thermal layer shirt. Another crew member quietly repeats calibration phrases into a headset without waiting for a response confirmation after each line. Reference lock confirmed. Timing offset confirmed. Rotational drift nominal. The phrases keep returning, not dramatically, just steadily enough that the ship begins sounding less like a vehicle and more like an environment maintaining itself. Near the rear navigation wall, an older display still shows a simplified sky map designed for human readability instead of machine precision. The brighter stars remain labeled with familiar names. Major constellations are still faintly outlined for orientation support during early departure stages. Nobody uses that display for actual navigation anymore. But nobody disables it either. One of the younger crew members glances toward it repeatedly while reviewing trajectory updates on another screen. The behavior looks almost unconscious, like checking a shoreline while learning to swim farther from land. The artificial overlays across the main glass continue growing denser. Range circles, timing vectors, pulsar signatures, predictive drift corridors. Without them, the forward sky has already started losing intuitive directionality. The stars remain visible, but visibility alone no longer provides orientation the way people expect it to. The realization arrives quietly. Human beings do not naturally know where they are in deep space. They know how to interpret systems that tell them. A faint vibration passes upward through the deck as another internal stabilization routine completes somewhere below the navigation level. The cooling pump beneath the observation deck still cycles in the same uneven rhythm established earlier. 3 short vibrations. Then silence. Then the pattern again. After a while, the repetition becomes useful. Crew movement across the deck begins unconsciously syncing around it. Someone pauses beside a storage locker during the vibration cycle without seeming aware of it. The ship keeps building small artificial forms of stability wherever it can. Outside the glass, several brighter pulsars remain fixed inside highlighted tracking brackets, while the surrounding star fields drift almost imperceptibly around them. The navigation computer favors pulsars because their timing remains extraordinarily stable across immense distances. Some pulse hundreds of times every second with less variation than most mechanical clocks. The ship trusts them more than visual orientation, more than instinct, more than the human eye. A brief alignment fault flashes across one of the secondary displays near the rear console cluster. The warning disappears less than 2 seconds later after the system reacquires timing synchronization. Nobody reacts strongly. One officer reaches over, taps the edge of the screen twice, and continues reading calibration values aloud. The ship is already normalized small instabilities. That adaptation happens faster than expected. A maintenance cart remains parked near the far corridor entrance with one wheel unlocked. Every orientation adjustment pulls it slightly in a different direction before the magnetic floor grips compensate again. Tiny course corrections leave physical traces everywhere once people start noticing them. The older sky map near the rear wall finally powers down automatically during an energy redistribution cycle. The outlined constellations disappear first, then the labeled stars. Then the remaining background image dims until only the navigation grids remain visible across the room. Nobody turns the old display back on. For several minutes, the deck continues operating under wireframe projections alone, while the ship keeps recalculating its position against pulses arriving from dead stars scattered across distant regions of the galaxy. The forward observation glass reflects the moving grids faintly now. Artificial coordinates layered over familiar light. And behind them, the actual stars continue drifting slowly enough that the movement only becomes visible after looking away for a while. A crew member drags a folded condensation cloth slowly across the lower edge of the observation glass while the night cycle lighting remains dimmed across the deck. The cloth leaves a temporary clear path through the moisture before the transparency fogs again several seconds later from residual temperature differences inside the viewing chamber. Nobody seems interested in fully removing it anymore. People only clear small sections where they happen to be standing. Beyond the glass, the Milky Way no longer fills the sky evenly. The change remains gradual enough to deny if someone only looks occasionally. But during longer observation shifts, the geometry becomes harder to ignore. The brighter galactic regions now occupy a distinct curve stretching across one side of the forward view instead of surrounding the ship naturally. The structure itself remains recognizable. That may be the uncomfortable part. The spiral density bands are still visible. Dark dust fractures still cut through the brighter regions in familiar patterns. Dense clusters continue glowing near the thicker central areas exactly where they should be. Nothing appears damaged. The galaxy simply no longer behaves like an environment. It behaves like an object being observed from nearby. A soft indicator light continues blinking above one unused navigation console near the rear wall. No one disables it. The pulse repeats every few seconds beside an empty chair, while the rest of the deck remains mostly quiet except for cooling circulation and distant equipment vibration traveling through the hull. 3 short vibrations. Then silence. Then the pattern again. Someone nearby opens a sealed food container. The sound interrupts the environmental rhythm more than expected. Outside the ship, the curved galactic band appears slightly thinner now than it did several hours earlier. Not dramatically thinner, just compressed enough that the eye begins unconsciously measuring edges instead of immersion. The human brain notices containment quickly once boundaries become visible. A maintenance worker floats briefly above the magnetic deck while replacing an overhead panel filter near the observation corridor entrance. One hand remains hooked through a restraint loop while the other brushes accumulated dust away from the intake grill. The particles drift through the overhead light for several seconds before disappearing into the circulation vents. The ship keeps filtering itself constantly. Air, heat, condensation, motion, radiation, even orientation, especially orientation. The navigation overlays no longer dominate the observation glass the way they did earlier during calibration shifts. Most of the wireframe systems have dimmed into standby transparency now that the outbound trajectory remains stable. Only a few faint coordinate traces continue sliding across the stars at slow intervals. Without the overlays, the galaxy looks quieter, more physical, and strangely farther away. A woman seated near the forward glass removes her headset after listening to archived Earth weather recordings routed through the private audio channels. Ocean conditions somewhere along the North Atlantic coast. Rain striking metal railings. Wind moving through structures built close to water. The recordings stop. The observation deck becomes mechanically quiet again. For a while, she continues looking outward even though nothing visible changes. The Milky Way rotates slowly enough that direct motion remains difficult to perceive. Instead, the change appears indirectly through prolonged comparison. Bright regions drift farther toward the edge of the viewing frame, Darker gaps widen slightly between recognizable structures. It resembles watching a familiar city skyline from a departing aircraft long after individual buildings stop being identifiable. Not gone. Just reorganized into shape instead of place. The realization arrives almost accidentally during the middle of an otherwise ordinary monitoring cycle. Home is partly a problem of perspective density. As long as something surrounds you completely, the mind experiences it as reality itself. Only distance allows structure to emerge. The thought passes quickly. A nearby crew member asks another for updated thermal readings without looking away from the observation glass. Someone farther down the corridor laughs once at something unheard through a private headset channel. The environmental systems continue cycling air through the deck with the same low mechanical pressure that has remained present since departure. Ordinary behavior persists easily inside altered conditions. That adaptation may happen faster than humans understand it. The ship rotates slightly during a scheduled orientation correction. The galactic curve shifts downward across the forward glass just enough for the upper edge of the spiral band to become fully visible for the first time since departure began. Nobody announces it. No alarms trigger. No procedural language changes. But several people stop moving briefly anyway. The visible edge remains faint. Still incomplete. Still partially dissolved into surrounding star fields, yet unmistakably separate from the rest of the sky. For most of human history, nobody could see the Milky Way this way while remaining inside it. Embedded existence hides large structures naturally. Forests rarely resemble patterns from the ground. Cities do not feel geometric while standing inside traffic. The galaxy only appears endless from positions still buried within its thickness. Distance reorganizes familiarity into shape. The observation glass begins fogging again near the lower edges where body heat gathers closest to the viewing rail. Someone wipes another clear section absent-mindedly, using the side of a sleeve this time instead of the condensation cloth left nearby earlier. The temporary clearing reveals the galactic band again. Curved. Luminous. Contained. For several seconds, it almost resembles archival telescope imagery more than lived environment. That sensation disappears as soon as the eye relaxes again, then returns a few minutes later. The alternation becomes difficult to ignore once it starts. The ship continues forward under stable guidance while the galaxy slowly compresses itself into visible structure beyond the glass. And across the observation deck, people keep adjusting themselves around the change in small physical ways before fully understanding what exactly has started feeling different. The observation deck lights remain dimmed through most of the transit cycle now. Only the navigation pathways and equipment indicators still carry strong illumination. Everything else settles into low reflected light from the displays and the stars beyond the glass. Faces appear softer this way. Edges lose definition. People move more slowly without realizing it. The air circulation system continues pushing a steady current downward through the ceiling vents. Cool air. Dry air. Filtered air. The sound barely changes hour to hour. After long enough, it stops feeling mechanical and starts resembling weather. Outside the ship, the visible structure of the galaxy has thinned further. The brighter concentrations still exist, but larger regions between them now remain almost featureless for extended stretches of observation. The eye keeps searching for continuity anyway. Small stars become temporary placeholders for missing density. Faint clusters appear more important than they really are, simply because fewer nearby points compete with them. Human perception keeps trying to repair the environment back into fullness. A crew member stands near the forward glass holding an empty drink container long after finishing it. One thumb taps lightly against the side in an uneven rhythm while he watches the sparse regions ahead. Nothing visible changes for several minutes at a time. Then eventually something does. Not movement, exactly. Separation. Two distant concentrations that once appeared connected no longer do. The gap between them has widened enough for the eye to stop grouping them together automatically. The transition feels strangely physical, like cracks spreading slowly through ice. The ship itself remains stable. Internal gravity cycles continue normally. Thermal systems continue compensating for external exposure changes. Somewhere deeper inside the hull, a maintenance routine briefly activates and sends a low vibration upward through the deck plating. 3 short vibrations. Then silence. Then the pattern again. A woman near the rear observation rail removes a maintenance access cover beneath one of the air recyclers and cleans dust accumulation from the filter mesh using a narrow suction tool. The process takes several minutes. Fine gray particles collect inside the transparent waste chamber while the ship continues forward through nearly empty space outside. The contrast begins feeling familiar now. Tiny physical maintenance inside expanding environmental sparsity. The forward observation glass no longer presents the sky as continuous texture. That condition weakened gradually enough that nobody reacted strongly when it first began happening. But the absence keeps accumulating. The darker regions are larger now. Not darker because something blocks light. Darker because less exists there. The distinction matters. A blunt operational statement appears briefly across one navigation monitor before disappearing back into background telemetry. Reference density reduced. No alarms follow it. No procedural correction required. Just information. Still, several crew members glance toward the forward glass afterward as if the sentence altered the visual field itself. In some ways, it does. The ship continues navigating normally because the remaining reference points are still sufficient for long-range tracking. Pulsars remain stable. Major stellar markers remain measurable. The systems function exactly as designed. But the environment outside those measurements has started losing texture faster than expected. A person can orient through sparse space. Living inside it feels different. The observation deck grows quieter over time as fewer people remain there continuously. Earlier departure shifts carried low conversation, repeated monitoring exchanges, unnecessary double checks. Those behaviors faded gradually once the outbound system stabilized. Now most speech arrives briefly. A thermal update. A navigation acknowledgement. Someone asking if the condensation cloth has been moved again. Then silence returns. The ship does not feel abandoned. Just operational. Outside the glass, isolated concentrations of stars now appear less like surrounding environment and more like distant structures suspended separately from one another. The galaxy still exists behind the ship in visible curvature, but forward observation increasingly reveals interruption instead of continuity. The eye keeps expecting hidden detail to emerge from the darker regions after prolonged staring. Usually none does. A navigation officer seated near the central console cluster finally disables one of the inactive wireframe overlays that has remained faintly drifting across the observation glass since earlier calibration phases. The projected grid disappears instantly. For a moment, the stars ahead look almost unstructured without it. No directional framework. No geometric assistance. Just separated points distributed across enormous depth. The overlay returns several seconds later automatically after the system detects manual deactivation. Nobody attempts to disable it again. The ship continues building artificial continuity where natural continuity weakens. Near the lower edge of the forward glass, faint condensation gathers again from residual interior warmth. Someone wipes a small circular clearing through it using the side of a hand without looking away from the stars. The cleared section reveals one isolated concentration ahead, bright enough to remain visible, small enough to feel distant from everything around it. For several seconds, the surrounding emptiness becomes easier to measure because of that single visible structure instead of despite it. Then the condensation slowly begins closing across the glass again while the ship continues deeper into regions where the stars no longer behave like an environment surrounding the observer. Only scattered locations inside a much larger absence. The archived recording starts quietly through the observation deck speakers while most of the ship remains inside reduced lighting mode. Wind moving through trees. Distant traffic crossing wet pavement. A dog barking somewhere far from the microphone position. The sounds are low enough that they blend into the air circulation hum at first. Several people on the deck do not seem to notice the recording immediately. Someone continues reading thermal diagnostics from a handheld display without looking up. Outside the observation glass, the galaxy drifts slowly across the forward frame. Not the stars. The galaxy. The distinction no longer feels semantic now. The full galactic plane has finally separated itself enough from the surrounding field to remain visible as one continuous external structure. Dense central regions still glow brighter near the middle, fading outward into thinner spiral density bands that taper into scattered concentrations along the edges. The Milky Way no longer behaves like sky. It behaves like an illuminated object suspended at a measurable distance from the ship. A crew member standing near the forward rail leans one hand against the glass for several seconds before realizing the surface temperature has dropped again. He pulls the hand away slowly and wipes a faint condensation print from the transparency with the side of his sleeve. The mark disappears. The galaxy remains. The ship continues rotating through minor stabilization adjustments while the galactic disk drifts almost imperceptibly downward across the viewing frame. The movement is too slow for the eye to track directly. People only notice after leaving the deck and returning late. Something always sits slightly lower than before. The archived Earth recording continues quietly. Rain against a window now. Soft electrical interference in the microphone. Someone breathing near the recording equipment without speaking. The sounds feel strangely enclosed compared to the observation deck. Earth weather contains surfaces, walls, ground, roofs, things for sound to strike. Out here, the environmental scale no longer provides that kind of physical closure naturally. The observation deck itself has started compensating for it. The lighting remains lower than operational requirements strictly demand. Air circulation stays audible. The navigation overlays reactivate automatically whenever somebody approaches the forward glass closely enough for the tracking systems to detect prolonged observation behavior. The ship keeps rebuilding orientation artificially. A woman seated near the rear console cluster watches the galactic disk through a narrow gap between two inactive monitors while absent-mindedly rewinding part of the Earth recording repeatedly through a private headset channel. The same 7 seconds of ocean wind. Again. Then again. Not emotionally. Almost procedurally. Like recalibrating against remembered environmental density. Outside the glass, the galaxy now appears fully directional. Left edge, central bulge, upper curvature, lower thinning regions. The mind keeps trying to interpret it as background anyway. Years of embedded existence resist the transition longer than expected. Even after the structure becomes visually obvious, part of perception still attempts to treat it like atmospheric sky instead of isolated matter. Then suddenly that interpretation fails. Not gradually. All at once. A crew member crossing the observation deck stops halfway between the navigation corridor and the forward glass. He looks outward for several seconds without speaking. Because from this angle, with the surrounding star density now sufficiently reduced, the galaxy finally resembles exactly what it is. One structure among others. Floating. Contained. Separate from the observer. The realization does not feel grand. It feels structurally wrong. The same way oceans would feel wrong if viewed hanging unsupported above a city. For most human lives, the Milky Way functioned as orientation without ever becoming object. Even people who understood galactic structure scientifically still experienced it emotionally as surrounding environment. Knowledge and perception remained separated cleanly. Not anymore. The ship continues drifting farther outside the dense stellar plane while the visible galaxy maintains its slow movement through the observation frame. The surrounding regions have become sparse enough now that the galactic disk appears almost brighter by contrast, even though onboard measurements show no meaningful luminosity increase. Emptiness changes scale perception faster than light does. The archived Earth audio stops abruptly when the playback cue ends. For a moment, nobody restarts it. The observation deck settles back into its operational soundscape. Ventilation hum. Cooling circulation. Soft monitor activity. 3 short vibrations from somewhere deeper inside the hull. Then silence. Then the pattern again. A navigation overlay briefly appears across the forward glass, placing coordinate brackets around the galactic center automatically before fading back into transparency. The system performs the identification routinely now. The ship increasingly treats the galaxy itself as a navigational reference object instead of environmental context. That procedural shift may be more psychologically destabilizing than the visual change. The galaxy can now be pointed at. Tracked. Measured externally. A maintenance worker passes through the observation corridor carrying a replacement air filter under one arm without looking out the glass at all. Another crew member sleeps lightly against a restraint seat near the rear wall, while pale galactic light drifts slowly across the side of his face through the ship's changing orientation angle. Ordinary behavior continues. That continuity almost makes the condition harder to process, because nothing catastrophic has happened. Reality simply reorganized itself into a different relationship around the observer. The galaxy still contains Earth somewhere inside its spiral structure. Still contains the solar system. Still contains every city, coastline, satellite, radio signal, and archived weather recording currently stored inside the ship's memory banks. But from here, the entire system has begun visually collapsing into one external location, suspended in darkness alongside everything else. The embedded perspective is broken now. Not philosophically. Visually. The eye can no longer fully return to the older interpretation once the separation becomes clear enough. Near the lower edge of the observation glass, condensation gathers again from residual body heat along the rail. Someone clears a narrow horizontal strip through it absent-mindedly while watching the galaxy drift across the opening. Floating. Curved. Self-contained. No longer overhead. And beyond it, the surrounding darkness continues outward far enough that the human mind gradually stops treating the galaxy as environment and starts treating it as position. The navigation room lights brighten automatically at the start of the recalibration cycle. Not fully bright. Just enough for the inactive displays to become visible again against the walls. Thin wireframe grids drift slowly across the central monitors while the ship compares its current trajectory against long-range reference timing gathered over the previous transit interval. Most of the crew remain quiet during recalibration periods. Conversation interferes with audio verification checks, and after enough repetition, people stop speaking unless necessary anyway. A navigation officer rotates one display manually using fingertip controls, even though the automated alignment completed several seconds earlier. The map turns slowly across the screen. Coordinate lattice. Reference markers. Distance vectors. Nothing visible outside the glass resembles the geometry being described anymore. That disconnect has started growing. The galaxy remains visible through the forward observation panels beyond the navigation room, but the operational models no longer prioritize what the eye naturally understands. The systems increasingly depend on timing relationships, gravitational references, and distributed signal consistency between objects too distant to feel physically connected. The maps still function. Understanding them intuitively is becoming something else. A verification tone sounds softly near the rear console cluster. Then another. A crew member reads comparison values aloud while another confirms them against a separate calculation stream running through an older backup processor, isolated from the primary navigation network. Agreement confirmed. Reference timing stable. External drift compensation stable. The phrases repeat with slight variations every few minutes. The ship sounds increasingly procedural during deep transit. Outside the room, the observation deck remains mostly dark except for faint reflected light from the galactic disk drifting slowly across the glass. From certain angles, the wireframe overlays projected onto the navigation monitors reflect faintly against the transparency, temporarily placing geometric structures across the visible galaxy itself. Artificial orientation layered over external reality. The visual combination begins feeling normal after long enough exposure. That may be part of the problem. A technician seated near the lower instrument bank removes a printed reference sheet from a storage sleeve and compares it against the rotating coordinate model above the console. The paper contains nothing visually recognizable anymore. Only numerical relationships. Timing intervals. Directional abstractions describing positions no human nervous system could naturally visualize directly. Still, people keep checking manually. Not because automation fails often, because humans trust repetition when environments stop feeling intuitive. The air circulation system continues moving steadily through the room. Cool. Dry. Filtered. A faint electrical hum remains constant behind the displays while the ship processes recalculation passes against external references scattered across distances large enough that light itself introduces operational delay into the measurements. One monitor briefly loses synchronization during a timing handoff between navigation arrays. The wireframe model bends slightly, then stabilizes again. Nobody reacts strongly. But one crew member instinctively looks toward the observation glass anyway, as if expecting visible reality outside to confirm whether the distortion mattered. It does not. The galaxy continues drifting silently beyond the ship exactly as before. That separation between visible reality and operational reality keeps widening. A map update scrolls slowly across the central display. Reference cluster removed from active orientation model. Insufficient density for reliable triangulation. The system immediately replaces the lost region with alternative timing anchors farther outward. Mathematically, the recalibration succeeds without difficulty. Psychologically, the removal feels heavier than expected. The navigation model no longer resembles movement through space. It resembles maintaining temporary coherence between isolated points inside expanding absence. A crew member near the side consoles quietly restarts the archived Earth recording from earlier transit cycles while reviewing rotational drift data. Ocean wind returns faintly through the room speakers. Distant rain. Low traffic noise. The sounds overlap strangely with the rotating coordinate grids. For several seconds, the room contains two incompatible environments simultaneously. Surface weather from Earth and abstract deep space orientation geometry drifting across darkened displays. A realization arrives during one of the quieter recalibration intervals. The maps are no longer helping people understand where they are. The maps are helping the ship continue functioning despite that failure. The distinction becomes difficult to ignore afterward. The navigation overlays continue rotating. Reference markers appear, disappear, reconnect somewhere else. Entire coordinate structures now derive meaning from mathematical consistency alone instead of recognizable visual relationships. The systems remain accurate, but accuracy has started detaching from direct human comprehension. One of the younger crew members stares at a rotating positional model for several seconds before finally asking another officer which direction the galactic center currently occupies relative to the ship. The answer comes immediately. Port aft rotational offset. 31 degrees below current observation plane. Technically precise. Almost impossible to imagine physically. The younger crew member nods anyway and returns to the console. Nobody comments further. 3 short vibrations pass upward through the floor plating from deeper inside the hull. Then silence. And the pattern again. The navigation room pauses briefly during a major synchronization pass while every active display aligns against the updated orientation model simultaneously. For a moment, the wireframe overlays across the monitors rotate together in perfect agreement before separating back into independent operational layers. The synchronization looks clean, elegant even. Yet the longer the systems operate successfully, the more obvious another condition becomes. Human intuition has stopped traveling alongside them. The ship still knows where it is. The crew can still verify every calculation manually. The trajectory remains stable. But direction itself has started becoming something procedural instead of experiential. Not something a person feels, something maintained. Outside the navigation room, the galaxy continues drifting slowly through the observation frame beyond the glass, while the surrounding darkness expands far beyond the region still dense enough for the eye to organize naturally. And across the monitors inside, rotating coordinate overlays continue describing locations the human mind can mathematically confirm while no longer fully understanding what those locations are supposed to feel like. The exterior observation windows look identical to the previous transit cycle. And the one before that. The same sparse concentrations of distant light remain suspended across the forward view in almost unchanged positions, while the ship continues moving through distances large enough that onboard instruments measure constant progression every second. But visually, the environment has nearly stopped responding. A crew member wipes sleep condensation from the side of a restraint seat near the observation corridor, while another replaces a worn thermal seal around one section of the lower maintenance hatch. Someone farther down the deck quietly folds a blanket into precise thirds before securing it beneath a storage strap beside the sleeping alcoves. The routines repeat. The exterior view does not seem to. Outside the glass, the galaxy still occupies one side of the visible frame as an isolated, drifting structure suspended beyond the ship. Its shape remains recognizable enough that people instinctively glance toward it occasionally for orientation, even though the navigation systems no longer depend on direct visual positioning for most calculations. The galactic disk appears slightly smaller now. Not enough to notice in a single observation period. Only across accumulated memory. That type of change behaves strangely inside the human nervous system. The mind tracks progression poorly when environments preserve their overall structure during movement. Motion becomes emotionally difficult to register without foreground transformation. The ship continues forward anyway. A soft verification tone sounds somewhere inside the navigation level below the observation deck. Then another several minutes later. The tones have become part of the ship's background atmosphere now, like cooling fans or air circulation pressure. 3 short vibrations pass upward through the floor plating. Then silence. Then the pattern again. A maintenance worker pauses beside the forward observation rail holding an inspection tablet against one arm while waiting for a diagnostic cycle to finish. He looks outward through the glass for almost a full minute without changing expression. Nothing outside visibly changes during the entire interval. The sensation resembles sitting inside a parked vehicle while scenery beyond the windows remains perfectly still. Except the instruments continue confirming enormous velocity constantly. The disconnect accumulates slowly. A navigation display mounted near the observation corridor refreshes automatically with updated distance values relative to several external reference structures. The numbers increase steadily. Millions of kilometers. Then more. The progression never stops. Yet the stars beyond the display remain nearly motionless. Human perception evolved around environments where movement produces immediate sensory consequence. Ground passing beneath feet. Trees shifting outside vehicle windows. Cloud systems approaching. Weather changing. Even aircraft preserve environmental motion through atmospheric texture. Out here, the scale breaks that relationship apart. A crew member seated near the rear bulkhead quietly restarts one of the archived Earth night recordings while reviewing sleep rotation schedules on a handheld display. Insects near a roadside microphone. Wind brushing across power lines. Water moving through a drainage tunnel after rain. The sounds imply movement, naturally. Things passing through physical environments. The observation deck does not. A blunt operational message appears briefly across one inactive monitor before fading back into standby mode. Trajectory progression nominal. The statement feels stranger than intended. Progression exists mathematically. Experientially, the ship increasingly feels suspended inside static surroundings. Several people have started sleeping longer between discretionary observation shifts. Not from fatigue, exactly. More from reduced perceptual variation. The exterior conditions change so gradually now that hours of observation sometimes produce almost no emotionally detectable environmental response. One crew member begins marking tiny grease pencil indicators near the lower edge of the observation glass at the end of each transit cycle. Not official measurements, just visual reference marks. Relative galaxy position, bright cluster alignment, angular spacing between isolated foreground stars. The markings are wiped away during cleaning routines afterward, then quietly replaced again later. A primitive attempt to make movement visible. The procedure works better than expected. After several cycles, the accumulated marks reveal slight external drift patterns the eye cannot naturally preserve alone. Tiny positional changes become undeniable once layered together physically across the glass surface. The stars are moving. Human perception simply struggles to carry enough stable comparison memory across intervals this large. The realization settles awkwardly. Motion has not disappeared.
Feedback has...
Near the center of the observation deck, someone opens a storage compartment and removes a replacement air filter cartridge wrapped in transparent protective material. The plastic crackles loudly in the otherwise quiet room before the sound fades back into ventilation hum and distant machine vibration. The ship remains full of small physical events. Fabric movement. Footsteps. Tools contacting metal surfaces. Condensation gathering along railings. Hands gripping warm drink containers during reduced lighting cycles. Inside the ship, motion still behaves normally. Outside, the universe increasingly refuses to provide perceptual confirmation that anything is happening at all. The navigation systems continue recalculating position continuously beneath the deck. Rotating coordinate overlays drift across monitors. Timing relationships remain stable. External reference anchors continue updating successfully. Operationally, the transit remains precise. Psychologically, the environment has begun flattening into repetition. The observation windows now resemble static images long enough between measurable changes that some crew members briefly forget which direction the ship is traveling until checking the orientation displays again. That moment happens more often lately. A person looks outward, sees the galaxy suspended motionless beyond the glass, then needs the instruments to remind them movement is still occurring. The separation between measurement and perception keeps widening. Near the end of the observation cycle, the archived Earth recording reaches its final segment. Distant highway noise passes through rain for several seconds before fading into microphone hiss and silence. Nobody restarts it this time. The ship continues forward through distances too large for ordinary sensory intuition to follow, while the external sky remains almost perfectly unchanged across the observation windows. And along the lower edge of the forward glass, faint grease pencil marks continue accumulating slowly enough that nobody notices how far they have drifted until comparing them against older positions left there weeks earlier. The exterior observation windows look identical to the previous transit cycle, and the one before that. The same sparse concentrations of distant light remain suspended across the forward view in almost unchanged positions, while the ship continues moving through distances large enough that onboard instruments measure constant progression every second. But visually, the environment has nearly stopped responding. A crew member wipes sleep condensation from the side of a restraint seat near the observation corridor, while another replaces a worn thermal seal around one section of the lower maintenance hatch. Someone farther down the deck quietly folds a blanket into precise thirds before securing it beneath a storage strap beside the sleeping alcoves. The routines repeat. The exterior view does not seem to. Outside the glass, the galaxy still occupies one side of the visible frame as an isolated, drifting structure suspended beyond the ship. Its shape remains recognizable enough that people instinctively glance toward it occasionally for orientation, even though the navigation systems no longer depend on direct visual positioning for most calculations. The galactic disk appears slightly smaller now. Not enough to notice in a single observation period. Only across accumulated memory. That type of change behaves strangely inside the human nervous system. The mind tracks progression poorly when environments preserve their overall structure during movement. Motion becomes emotionally difficult to register without foreground transformation. The ship continues forward anyway. A soft verification tone sounds somewhere inside the navigation level below the observation deck. Then, another several minutes later. The tones have become part of the ship's background atmosphere now, like cooling fans or air circulation pressure. 3 short vibrations pass upward through the floor plating. Then silence. Then the pattern again. A maintenance worker pauses beside the forward observation rail, holding an inspection tablet against one arm while waiting for a diagnostic cycle to finish. He looks outward through the glass for almost a full minute without changing expression. Nothing outside visibly changes during the entire interval. The sensation resembles sitting inside a parked vehicle while scenery beyond the windows remains perfectly still. Except the instruments continue confirming enormous velocity constantly. The disconnect accumulates slowly. A navigation display mounted near the observation corridor refreshes automatically with updated distance values relative to several external reference structures. The numbers increase steadily. Millions of kilometers. Then more. The progression never stops. Yet the stars beyond the display remain nearly motionless. Human perception evolved around environments where movement produces immediate sensory consequence. Ground passing beneath feet. Trees shifting outside vehicle windows. Cloud systems approaching. Weather changing. Even aircraft preserve environmental motion through atmospheric texture. Out here, the scale breaks that relationship apart. A crew member seated near the rear bulkhead quietly restarts one of the archived Earth night recordings while reviewing sleep rotation schedules on a handheld display. Insects near a roadside microphone. Wind brushing across power lines. Water moving through a drainage tunnel after rain. The sounds imply movement naturally. Things passing through physical environments. The observation deck does not. A blunt operational message appears briefly across one inactive monitor before fading back into standby mode. Trajectory progression nominal. The statement feels stranger than intended. Progression exists mathematically. Experientially, the ship increasingly feels suspended inside static surroundings. Several people have started sleeping longer between discretionary observation shifts. Not from fatigue exactly, more from reduced perceptual variation. The exterior conditions change so gradually now that hours of observation sometimes produce almost no emotionally detectable environmental response. One crew member begins marking tiny grease pencil indicators near the lower edge of the observation glass at the end of each transit cycle. Not official measurements, just visual reference marks. Relative galaxy position, bright cluster alignment, angular spacing between isolated foreground stars. The markings are wiped away during cleaning routines afterward, then quietly replaced again later. A primitive attempt to make movement visible. The procedure works better than expected. After several cycles, the accumulated marks reveal slight external drift patterns the eye cannot naturally preserve alone. Tiny positional changes become undeniable once layered together physically across the glass surface. The stars are moving. Human perception simply struggles to carry enough stable comparison memory across intervals this large. The realization settles awkwardly. Motion has not disappeared. Feedback has. Near the center of the observation deck, someone opens a storage compartment and removes a replacement air filter cartridge wrapped in transparent protective material. The plastic crackles loudly in the otherwise quiet room before the sound fades back into ventilation hum and distant machine vibration. The ship remains full of small physical events. Fabric movement. Footsteps. Tools contacting metal surfaces. Condensation gathering along railings. Hands gripping warm drink containers during reduced lighting cycles. Inside the ship, motion still behaves normally. Outside, the universe increasingly refuses to provide perceptual confirmation that anything is happening at all. The navigation systems continue recalculating position continuously beneath the deck. Rotating coordinate overlays drift across monitors. Timing relationships remain stable. External reference anchors continue updating successfully. Operationally, the transit remains precise. Psychologically, the environment has begun flattening into repetition. The observation windows now resemble static images long enough between measurable changes that some crew members briefly forget which direction the ship is traveling until checking the orientation displays again. That moment happens more often lately. A person looks outward, sees the galaxy suspended motionless beyond the glass, then needs the instruments to remind them movement is still occurring. The separation between measurement and perception keeps widening. Near the end of the observation cycle, the archived Earth recording reaches its final segment. Distant highway noise passes through rain for several seconds before fading into microphone hiss and silence. Nobody restarts it this time. The ship continues forward through distances too large for ordinary sensory intuition to follow, while the external sky remains almost perfectly unchanged across the observation windows. And along the lower edge of the forward glass, faint grease pencil marks continue accumulating slowly enough that nobody notices how far they have drifted until comparing them against older positions left there weeks earlier. The magnification display flickers once before stabilizing against the forward observation glass. A neighboring galaxy sharpens slowly into visibility across the enlarged projection field. Not enough detail to resemble nearby structure, only a concentrated luminous form suspended beyond the drifting edge of the Milky Way. Its brighter central region remains visible while the outer halo dissolves gradually into surrounding blackness. Several crew members continue working without looking up. One person near the rear maintenance console quietly reads fuel allocation estimates from a handheld display, while another reviews recycling efficiency reports beside the thermal management wall. The discussion remains calm. Reserve margins stable. Consumption trends acceptable. Long-term redistribution possible if required. The phrases sound ordinary. Inside the magnified observation field, an entire galaxy remains suspended beyond the ship. The ship has entered a region where neighboring structures remain continuously visible through assisted observation systems now. Not stars. Not isolated clusters. Other galaxies. The transition arrived gradually enough that nobody formally announced it. At first, the external structures appeared indistinct, temporary concentrations mistaken for background artifacts or instrument bloom. Then repeated observation confirmed positional consistency across multiple cycles. Now the systems track them automatically. Label them. Measure relative displacement. The neighboring galaxies remain visually present for hours at a time. That visibility changes something unexpectedly. Not emotionally, through wonder. Almost the opposite. The galaxies remain too distant for the nervous system to treat them as reachable despite direct visibility. Human perception evolved under conditions where seeing something implied at least theoretical physical relationship. Mountains could be crossed. Lights approached. Weather systems arrived eventually. Out here, visibility has detached from emotional accessibility. A crew member seated near the forward rail adjusts the magnification field manually using slow fingertip movements against the control surface. The neighboring galaxy expands slightly across the display. Still unreachable. Still emotionally abstract. The image resembles archival astronomy photography more than environmental reality, even while hanging directly outside the ship. That separation keeps deepening. 3 short vibrations move through the observation deck floor. Then silence. Then the pattern again. Someone near the side corridor pauses mid-conversation while looking between the enlarged neighboring galaxy and the smaller visible structure of the Milky Way, drifting farther across the opposite side of the observation frame. For several seconds, both galaxies remain visible simultaneously. One containing Earth, the other existing entirely outside every human historical environment. The visual relationship feels mathematically coherent. Psychologically, it does not settle correctly. A navigation overlay briefly appears across the magnification field, while the system updates relative orientation markers between nearby local group structures. Thin coordinate traces connect luminous regions separated by distances large enough that even transmitted light requires immense spans of time to cross between them. The overlay fades again after calibration completes. The galaxies remain. A maintenance worker carrying replacement coolant seals walks through the observation corridor without slowing down. Someone else unwraps compressed meal packaging near the rear bulkhead while reviewing long-term oxygen recovery projections projected faintly across a portable display. Ordinary procedural behavior continues beneath visible intergalactic scale. That continuity has become one of the ship's most stable conditions. The neighboring galaxies drift almost imperceptibly relative to the ship's position over long observation intervals. Instruments confirm constant relational movement. Human perception barely registers it directly. The structures remain fixed enough that the mind interprets them more like permanent backdrop imagery than physical locations inside active space. The failure happens quietly. Human-scale intuition stops attaching meaning to visible distance once the numbers exceed emotional processing capacity. The galaxies can still be measured, compared, tracked, but no longer felt properly. A blunt factual statement appears across one side monitor during a navigational context update. Nearest external galactic structure remains outside practical transit range under current propulsion limits. Nobody reacts visibly. The information contains nothing surprising. Still, the sentence alters the room slightly after appearing. Visibility normally implies possibility. The systems no longer pretend that relationship remains true. A crew member near the magnification controls increases image stabilization briefly, sharpening one neighboring galaxy enough for faint internal asymmetry to become visible along the outer luminous region. The structure exists clearly enough to observe shape, not clearly enough to emotionally interpret as place. That distinction becomes difficult to escape afterward. The archived Earth recordings have stopped entirely now. Nobody has restarted them in several transit cycles. The observation deck instead fills mostly with ventilation pressure, distant system vibrations, occasional verification tones from lower navigation levels, and quiet operational conversation about long-term resource balancing. Water reserves, heat recycling, sleep rotation adjustments, filter replacement intervals. The ship increasingly sounds like a closed environmental system maintaining itself across durations too large for ordinary travel psychology. Outside the glass, entire galaxies remain suspended beyond reach while still fully visible. A person standing near the observation rail lifts one hand toward the magnified projection unconsciously for a moment while speaking to another crew member about fuel reserve redistribution. The gesture stops halfway. The galaxy remains fixed in the display field. Cold. Bright. Perfectly observable. Emotionally inaccessible. The realization arrives late. Distance eventually becomes something other than separation. At certain scales, it stops behaving like experience entirely and becomes pure information. The nervous system still recognizes structure, but the internal feeling of relationship collapses underneath the measurement. The ship continues moving through mathematically coherent space while human intuition falls farther behind the scale required to emotionally inhabit it. Near the lower edge of the observation glass, faint grease pencil reference marks still remain from earlier transit cycles. Small alignment traces beside isolated stars. Tiny directional corrections. Accumulated attempts to preserve visible movement across nearly static observation periods. Now another crew member quietly adds a new mark beside the magnified neighboring galaxy. Not because the galaxy appears close. Because it appears visible enough that part of the mind still expects visibility to mean something physically graspable. The mark remains on the glass while the galaxy itself continues hanging impossibly far beyond it, suspended inside distances large enough that human emotional scale no longer fully attaches to what the eyes can see. The observation deck lights dim another level during the artificial night cycle. Not enough to darken the room completely. Just enough for the remaining illuminated surfaces to separate from the glass more slowly when someone turns their head. A faint reflection of the interior still hangs across the observation windows. Storage rails. Empty restraint seats. One maintenance cart parked near the rear corridor with its wheel locks engaged. Beyond the reflection, the external sky remains almost unchanged from the previous cycle. Only thinner now. The neighboring galaxy, visible through magnification earlier, has already rotated outside the forward observation angle. The enlarged projection systems have powered down again. Most of the glass now shows only scattered star concentrations separated by wide regions where almost nothing visible occupies the frame. The sparse regions last longer each cycle. A crew member seated near the forward rail adjusts the brightness on a handheld maintenance display several times before finally lowering it enough to stop reflecting against the glass. The movement feels automatic now. People protect the exterior visibility instinctively, even when there is very little left to see directly. 3 short vibrations pass upward through the floor. Then silence. Then the pattern again. The ship continues drifting through regions between larger structures where the visible density of matter drops sharply. Instruments still track enormous amounts of distributed mass beyond immediate perception. Gravitational mapping continues functioning normally. Background radiation measurements remain stable. But visually, the environment has started losing texture. The stars still exist. They simply no longer organize themselves into anything the eye experiences as surrounding environment. A woman near the rear bulkhead folds a thermal blanket around her shoulders while reviewing lighting rotation schedules projected faintly across a portable screen. The ship has adjusted interior brightness cycles several times during transit. Lower light levels reduce eye strain during prolonged observation shifts when external visibility becomes sparse. The adaptation works. That may be part of the problem, too. People now move through the observation deck comfortably while surrounded by views that would once have felt incomplete. The forward glass contains isolated concentrations of light separated by distances too large for ordinary perception to emotionally bridge together. Small clusters appear briefly meaningful until the eye notices how much emptiness surrounds them. Then the clusters flatten again into isolated points. No one comments on it anymore. A navigation update scrolls quietly across one inactive side monitor. External reference density reduced. Additional interpolation active. The message disappears. Nothing visibly changes afterward. Near the lower edge of the observation glass, old grease pencil alignment marks remain faintly visible beneath newer corrections layered over them. Some correspond to stars no longer inside the forward observation angle. Others track neighboring galactic structures that now sit somewhere beyond the ship's current orientation. The marks stay on the glass longer lately before anyone wipes them away. A crew member standing near the center corridor stares outward for several seconds before finally asking whether the forward observation systems are still running at full sensitivity. Another crew member confirms they are. The exchange ends there. Because the systems are functioning correctly. The sky actually looks like this now. That realization settles differently than earlier perceptual distortions did. Nothing is malfunctioning. The ship has not lost orientation. The observation windows are not damaged. The environment itself has simply become sparse enough that the nervous system stops interpreting it as populated space. A faint cooling hiss moves through the overhead circulation vents while someone near the rear maintenance wall slowly secures fresh filter mesh into an intake housing. Tiny dust particles drift briefly through the dim light before disappearing upward into the ventilation system. Inside the ship, small physical textures still dominate attention naturally. Fabric creasing against restraint straps. Warm metal surfaces holding residual heat from human contact. Condensation gathering slowly near the lower window seals. The universe outside increasingly does not. The visible stars drift so gradually across the observation glass now that movement only becomes apparent through accumulated absence. One isolated concentration visible near the left edge of the frame several cycles earlier has already disappeared completely beyond the observation boundary. Nobody saw it leave. It was simply there less often. Then eventually not at all. The transition happened too slowly for the nervous system to register as motion. A thought arrives late during the middle of an otherwise ordinary maintenance interval. Human orientation may depend less on visible objects than on the expectation that something will eventually appear nearby. Out here, that expectation weakens. The ship continues operating normally through the thinning regions between larger structures. Verification tones still sound periodically from lower navigation levels. Interior clocks still cycle through scheduled day and night transitions. Resource balancing discussions continue quietly near the maintenance consoles. Water recovery stable. Food reserves stable. Sleep schedule adjustments approved. The ordinary procedural language feels denser than the universe outside the glass now. Near the end of the lighting cycle, someone finally wipes away part of the old grease pencil markings near the lower observation rail using a damp cloth. Several alignment traces disappear immediately. Others remain faintly visible underneath. The glass clears. Beyond it, only a handful of scattered concentrations remain suspended across enormous stretches of nearly structureless black. And after several minutes of looking outward, the eye gradually stops expecting the empty regions to contain anything else at all. The archived navigation recording begins with microphone static. Then a voice. Calm. Focused. Slightly younger than the crew currently aboard the ship. Primary orientation lock established. Relative position stable against galactic reference plane. The recording continues quietly through the observation deck speakers while the current crew moves through dim lighting routines beneath it. Someone near the rear corridor secures loose thermal fabric beneath a restraint strap. Another person checks moisture accumulation around the lower window seals using a narrow inspection light that leaves brief white reflections drifting across the glass. Outside the observation windows, the Milky Way hangs far beyond the ship now. Still recognizable. Still structured. Still visibly spiral. But smaller than before. The reduction did not happen dramatically enough for anyone to notice on a single day. The galaxy simply occupies less of the observation frame each cycle, while larger regions of empty intergalactic distance continue expanding around it. A crew member near the forward rail pauses beside the glass during the archived playback without speaking. The old navigation voice continues. Galactic center maintaining stable aft orientation. Rotational correction unnecessary. The language feels strange now. Not technically inaccurate. Emotionally outdated. The recording comes from a period when the galaxy still functions psychologically as surrounding environment. The voice describes orientation relative to the Milky Way the way sailors once described coastlines remaining behind a vessel after departure. But the observation windows no longer present the galaxy that way. Now it resembles one external structure among many others suspended through deep darkness. The shift happened gradually enough that nobody formally reacted when it began. 3 short vibrations pass upward through the floor. Then silence. Then the pattern again. Near the lower edge of the observation glass, several old grease pencil marks still remain faintly visible despite repeated cleaning cycles. One traces the previous position of a neighboring galaxy no longer inside the forward observation angle. Another marks an older alignment position for the Milky Way itself from weeks earlier. The distance between the old mark and the current visible position is no longer subtle. A navigation officer seated beside the side console cluster rewinds part of the archived recording briefly before letting it continue again. Background chatter fills the speakers for several seconds. Minor calibration confirmation. Someone laughing quietly after a mistimed coordinate entry. A cup contacting metal. The ordinary sound texture feels denser than the exterior sky now visible beyond the glass. Outside, the Milky Way rotates slowly enough against surrounding darkness that direct movement remains almost impossible to perceive. Yet the separation surrounding it has grown large enough that the galaxy no longer dominates the observation field emotionally, even while remaining clearly visible. That may be the strangest transition so far. Recognition survives. Centrality does not. A person can still point toward Earth from here. Approximately. The spiral arm containing the solar system remains identifiable through enhanced orientation overlays when the ship activates them. Navigation systems still label the galactic center automatically. Position tracking remains mathematically precise. But the emotional architecture surrounding those recognitions has weakened. The galaxy no longer feels like background reality. It feels like one location. The distinction settles slowly. A maintenance worker kneels beside an open equipment panel near the rear observation corridor, replacing degraded airflow mesh, while the archived navigation logs continue playing softly overhead. Dust gathers inside the edge of the replacement filter under the inspection light. Tiny particles drift upward briefly through the ventilation current before disappearing. Inside the ship, environmental maintenance still behaves normally. Outside, the universe increasingly does not organize itself around human relational instinct anymore. The archived voice pauses during a section of transmission interference. Static washes softly through the observation deck for several seconds before the signal stabilizes again. Visual orientation remains intuitive. The sentence arrives clearly through the speakers. Several people glance toward the observation glass afterward without fully meaning to, because it no longer feels true. The Milky Way still remains visible enough to recognize immediately. Its spiral structure still curves faintly across one section of the darkness beyond the ship. Dense regions still glow brighter than the surrounding halo. The galaxy has not become unfamiliar. It has become externally located. That change weakens something quietly. Human beings evolved inside environments where home remained visually dominant even at great distance. Mountains shrink, but still organize landscapes. Cities disappear slowly beneath aircraft windows while preserving emotional orientation. Coastlines continue anchoring direction long after individual buildings vanish. The galaxy no longer behaves that way. Now, neighboring structures occupy comparable emotional weight across the observation field. Small external galaxies drift through magnified sectors. Sparse intergalactic regions dominate larger portions of visible space. The Milky Way remains identifiable without remaining psychologically central. A realization interrupts the middle of an otherwise procedural observation. Home may depend partly on environmental dominance, not memory alone. The archived recording continues quietly through the speakers. Rotational drift nominal. Primary orientation stable. The voice sounds increasingly disconnected from the visible condition outside the ship. Not because the earlier crew misunderstood anything. Because embedded existence changes perception automatically. People inside systems rarely experience those systems as isolated objects until enough external distance accumulates around them. Near the forward observation rail, someone places a fresh grease pencil mark beside the current visible edge of the Milky Way. The motion feels slower this time. More careful. The mark remains small against the glass. Beyond it, the galaxy hangs suspended through immense darkness as a distant luminous spiral no longer emotionally larger than the surrounding universe around it. The archived recording reaches the end of its playback queue a few minutes later. Microphone hiss continues briefly through the speakers. Then silence. No one restarts the file immediately. The observation deck settles back into ventilation hum, faint equipment vibration, distant verification tones from lower navigation levels, and the enormous quiet outside the glass where the Milky Way now drifts slowly through space, like any other visible structure. Recognizable. Trackable. Still containing Earth somewhere inside it, but no longer filling enough of reality to automatically feel like the center of anything. The transmission timer continues counting upward without interruption. 8 minutes. Then 9. Then 10. No new signal arrives during the entire interval. A communications officer seated near the rear console cluster adjusts the sleeve of a thermal layer shirt away from one wrist while reviewing the outbound transmission log projected faintly across the display. The entries remain orderly. Message sent. Relay alignment confirmed. Transmission integrity stable. Awaiting response. The procedures still function normally. That part never changed. The communications room remains dim except for the status indicators spread across the equipment wall. Small confirmation lights pulse softly beside inactive channels. Cooling fans cycle beneath the floor plating in long, steady intervals, while someone near the side console carefully reseats an audio connector that has started slipping loose during vibration cycles. 3 short vibrations move through the deck. Then silence. Then the pattern again. Nobody looks up from their work. Outside the narrow observation port near the transmission room ceiling, the Milky Way remains visible as a distant spiral structure drifting slowly across deep blackness. Most of the communications crew rarely watches it directly anymore during signal shifts. The room itself demands attention differently. Timers. Delays. Confirmation windows. Transmission schedules. The operational rhythm has gradually separated action from consequence. A crew member near the primary relay controls presses transmit authorization against a small, illuminated panel. The command leaves the ship immediately. The room itself does not react afterward. No sound changes. No visual response arrives. The transmission indicator simply shifts color and begins another delay count. Waiting has become one of the ship's primary environmental conditions. An archived outbound message scrolls slowly across one inactive side monitor during automatic system maintenance. Routine status confirmation. Resource stability acceptable. Crew condition nominal. The message was transmitted weeks earlier according to ship time. No response has returned yet. That absence no longer feels unusual enough to interrupt routine procedure. The communication systems still operate continuously. Scheduled exchanges continue, leaving the ship exactly on time. Alignment corrections still compensate for relative motion between the vessel and increasingly distant relay structures positioned far behind it. Technically, the conversation with Earth still exists. Emotionally, it has begun separating into unrelated events. A woman seated near the secondary relay station removes one earphone briefly and rubs the bridge of her nose while the response timer continues climbing upward beside her display. 11 minutes. 12. The timer itself has become more psychologically active than the messages passing through it. Earlier in the mission, transmissions still felt connected to immediate consequence. Questions implied answers. Decisions implied reaction. Even delayed communication preserved enough temporal continuity for the nervous system to emotionally bridge cause and effect together. That condition weakened slowly. Now, entire operational discussions often conclude before earlier transmissions finish arriving. A crew member can send an equipment recommendation knowing the receiving personnel will not read it until the originating situation has already evolved into something else entirely. The ship continues adapting around that separation procedurally. Requests become broader. Instructions grow less specific. More operational autonomy shifts locally because reaction itself no longer functions quickly enough to matter emotionally. Near the rear equipment wall, someone replaces degraded insulation around a signal conduit, while another crew member quietly reviews transmission drift compensation values through a handheld diagnostic screen. The room sounds mostly mechanical now. Ventilation pressure, cooling circulation, soft verification tones, occasional static bursts from alignment recalibration. The human voices arrive less frequently between them. A blunt operational statement appears briefly across the central monitor during a synchronization cycle. Estimated response delay exceeds meaningful procedural intervention threshold. The message disappears automatically after several seconds. No alarms follow it. The communication systems continue functioning exactly as designed. That may be the uncomfortable part. Nothing has failed. Cause and effect have simply stretched too far apart for human emotional timing to hold them together naturally anymore. The response timer reaches 14 minutes, while the crew continues ordinary maintenance behavior beneath it. Someone unwraps nutrient packaging near the side corridor. The technician checks condensation gathering around a lower cooling manifold using a cloth already darkened from repeated use. One transmission channel briefly fills with low interference before stabilizing again. The waiting continues through all of it. A younger crew member near the relay controls finally asks whether the incoming response window from Earth still overlaps with the next scheduled outbound cycle. Another officer checks the timing model. Barely. The answer arrives without emotion. Because everyone in the room already understands what the overlap means. The ship may receive responses to situations that no longer exist by the time the reply arrives. A realization settles awkwardly several minutes later during another silent transmission interval. Communication still technically connects the ship to Earth, but not to the same present. The distinction changes the room slightly after it appears. Messages stop feeling conversational once enough delay accumulates between action and acknowledgement. They begin behaving more like archived records exchanged between different versions of reality. The communications crew keeps operating anyway. Transmission schedules remain precise. Alignment routines continue. Status reports leave exactly on time. Outside the small observation port, the Milky Way continues drifting slowly through the darkness beyond the ship, while the response timer climbs steadily upward beside the relay console. 17 minutes. Then 18. No one watches the numbers continuously anymore. That adaptation happened quietly. Near the end of the shift cycle, an incoming confirmation finally appears across the central display. The room does not react immediately because the signal arrives silently at first. Only the small indicator light changes color. Someone notices it several seconds later and leans forward to open the message queue. The response contains routine acknowledgement only. Transmission received. Relay synchronization stable. No further updates required at this time. The message timestamp already belongs to an earlier operational period aboard the ship. The crew reads it anyway. Then the reply window closes. And across the communications room, the transmission timers begin counting upward again before anyone fully finishes processing the last response that arrived from a version of Earth already farther in the past than the room emotionally expected. The observation windows look exactly the same as they did 3 sleep cycles earlier. A crew member standing near the forward glass checks the timestamp twice anyway, then looks back outside. Nothing visible confirms the elapsed distance. The same sparse concentrations remain suspended across the darkness beyond the ship. The same faint reflection of interior lighting still hangs across the lower corners of the observation panels. One grease pencil alignment mark near the forward rail continues sitting beside the distant edge of the Milky Way, almost unchanged to the eye. Only the clocks insist movement happened. A woman near the rear corridor removes a sleep monitor patch from the inside of her wrist and folds it carefully into a disposal packet, while another crew member reviews circadian adjustment recommendations projected faintly across a portable medical display. Extended wake irregularity increasing. Dream continuity reduction reported. Environmental progression perception unstable. The language remains clinical. Nobody discusses it much afterward. 3 short vibrations move through the deck. Then silence. Then the pattern again. The ship continues operating normally. That consistency has started becoming psychologically difficult in ways the earlier instability never was. During the first phases of departure, perception still received enough visible environmental change to emotionally metabolize the movement. The galaxy shifted position, star density thinned, neighboring structures emerged. Communication delays stretched longer. Now the environment changes too slowly for ordinary cognition to continuously absorb. The nervous system keeps resetting reality back into stillness between measurable differences. A navigation technician seated beneath the side observation panels rewinds an exterior mapping sequence captured several months earlier, according to ship time. The footage accelerates the ship's forward transit into visible progression. The Milky Way contracts slowly across the frame. External galaxies drift. Reference stars separate. The movement becomes obvious immediately once compressed into faster playback. The technician watches the sequence once, then closes it. Outside the actual observation windows, the universe returns to apparent stillness again. A realization arrives late. Human perception may require visible resistance to emotionally process motion. Inside the ship, resistance still exists everywhere. Fabric pulls against restraint straps. Condensation gathers around lower cooling lines. Muscles fatigue. Metal surfaces warm beneath repeated contact. Time still behaves physically. Outside the glass, scale has weakened those conformations almost completely. A crew member near the observation rail quietly asks another whether the forward observation windows have been cleaned recently. The answer comes back immediately. Twice this week. The question was not really about maintenance. The exterior conditions simply resemble static imagery long enough now that part of the mind keeps searching for operational explanations. A medical advisory notification scrolls silently across one side monitor. Increased orientation drift during wake transitions remains expected. Visual continuity exposure recommended during adjustment periods. The message disappears automatically after several seconds. No one comments on it. The recommendation has already become routine procedure aboard the ship. Crew members spend scheduled periods inside the observation decks specifically to preserve continuity between internal time perception and external positional awareness. The method works only partially. A person can understand the ship is moving. They can verify the calculations manually. But emotional cognition adapts differently. Several crew members have started describing distant structures by their grease pencil positions on the glass instead of their actual astronomical orientation data. Slightly above the lower mark. Left of the old spiral reference. Near the wiped section by the rail. The behavior emerged gradually. The physical markings now feel more stable than the external universe they represent. Near the rear bulkhead, someone replaces degraded adhesive strips around a storage compartment, while another crew member quietly reviews sleep cycle compression reports beneath dim task lighting. The room sounds ordinary. Ventilation hums. Soft equipment clicks. Distant relay tones from lower communications levels. The occasional sound of fabric moving during restrained sleep shifts nearby. Human environments still preserve understandable scale. Outside, the visible universe no longer does. The observation windows continue presenting nearly unchanged conditions across intervals large enough that memory itself begins compressing. Weeks flatten together visually. Entire transit periods leave behind almost no distinct exterior identity except for tiny positional differences measurable only through accumulated comparison. One crew member standing near the forward glass finally places two fingertips directly against an older grease pencil mark beside the Milky Way. Then slowly compares it against the galaxy's current visible position. The gap is undeniable once measured physically. Several centimeters. Months of travel. The eye never felt the movement happen. That may be the important part. The human brain can confirm progression without emotionally experiencing it. A procedural voice from the medical systems interrupts the observation silence briefly. Scheduled sleep phase adjustment begins in 20 minutes. Lighting transition imminent. Nobody reacts strongly. The announcement repeats every cycle now. Artificial mornings. Artificial nights. Artificial continuity markers layered inside a reality too large to naturally structure itself around human biological timing anymore. A crew member seated near the lower observation rail closes tired eyes for several seconds during the lighting transition, while the exterior view remains almost perfectly unchanged beyond the glass. Then opens them again. Still the same sparse concentrations. Still the same reflections. Still the same distant spiral structure hanging far beyond the ship. Except not the same. The ship has traveled enormous distances since the previous observation cycle. Perception simply refused to carry the movement continuously enough for the nervous system to feel it happening in real time. The realization does not feel dramatic. Mostly exhausting. because the mission still physically functions. The calculations remain correct. The ship continues moving. Human cognition is the thing beginning to strain under the scale. Near the end of the cycle, the observation deck lights dim gradually into artificial night mode again. Interior reflections spread softly back across the glass. The grease pencil markings become more visible against the darkness outside. And beyond them, the distant Milky Way remains suspended in almost the same position it occupied yesterday, and last week, and months earlier, while the ship continues crossing distances too large for the brain to emotionally assemble into lived experience. The replayed Earth recording begins with silverware touching ceramic. Then distant conversation. Someone laughing briefly near the microphone before a door closes somewhere deeper inside the recording environment. The sound remains low across the observation deck speakers while the crew moves quietly through another long-duration viewing shift. A man near the forward rail tightens the cuff around one sleeve and settles deeper into the restraint seat without taking his eyes off the glass. Outside, the Milky Way hangs across the darkness as a thin, luminous spiral. Clearly structured now. Clearly separate. The central bulge remains visible as a brighter concentration near the middle, while the outer spiral arms dissolve gradually into faint trailing density along the edges. Several darker fractures still cut through the galactic disk where dense dust regions interrupt the light behind them. Nothing about the structure looks unfamiliar. That condition survived the distance. A crew member near the side observation panel slowly traces one of the older grease pencil alignment marks with a fingertip while comparing it against the current position of the galaxy. The motion feels absent-minded now, almost routine. 3 short vibrations move upward through the floor. Then silence. Then the pattern again. The observation deck lighting remains dim enough that the galaxy reflects faintly across the lower window surfaces. Interior details overlap the spiral structure softly. Empty restraint frames. Condensation near the rail seals. One folded thermal blanket resting across the back of an unused seat. The Milky Way no longer dominates the room visually, even while remaining the largest structure outside the ship. That transition arrived quietly. Earlier in the mission, simply seeing the galaxy restored orientation automatically. The spiral arms still implied Earth somewhere inside them. Familiarity itself carried emotional structure. Now the galaxy behaves differently. Recognition remains immediate. Belonging does not. A woman seated near the rear observation wall replays part of the Earth recording again through a private headset channel. Rain against pavement this time. Someone crossing a street while distant traffic passes through water. The sounds feel local, contained. Built around surfaces close enough for ordinary movement to matter. Outside the glass, the galaxy no longer carries that feeling. It resembles a photograph suspended beyond the ship more than an environment containing it. A navigation overlay briefly appears across the observation windows during automatic orientation verification. Thin geometric markers spread across the galactic disk, labeling rotational direction, central mass orientation, and relative structural positioning. The overlay disappears several seconds later. The galaxy remains behind it. Still recognizable, still detached. A realization arrives in the middle of an otherwise ordinary observation cycle. Familiarity does not necessarily preserve relationship. The thought passes quietly. No one on the observation deck reacts outwardly to anything changing. A maintenance worker near the lower rail wipes moisture from the edge of the viewing seal using the cloth darkened from repeated cleaning cycles. Another crew member unwraps compressed nutrient packaging slowly enough that the plastic crackling becomes briefly louder than the ventilation system. Inside the ship, human scale still exists everywhere. Outside, the Milky Way has become geometry. The spiral structure rotates slowly enough against surrounding space that direct movement remains difficult to perceive without long comparison intervals. Yet the galaxy no longer feels stationary either. It behaves like a visible object drifting independently through a much larger environment beyond it. That may be the deeper transition. Home no longer functions as background reality. It functions as observation target. A crew member standing near the forward glass finally activates one of the older archived Earth-sky recordings stored in the ship database. The display projects a nighttime field from northern hemisphere ground level. Trees moving in wind. Cloud cover shifting slowly overhead. The Milky Way visible faintly across Earth atmosphere. The comparison remains active beside the actual observation windows for several minutes. The difference feels almost procedural at first. Atmospheric distortion. Reduced visibility. Narrower field of view. Then something else emerges. From Earth, the galaxy still behaves like sky. Even obscured, it surrounds the observer naturally. The atmosphere softens the edges enough that the structure blends back into environmental scale. Outside the ship, no atmosphere remains to protect that illusion. The galaxy appears physically exposed. Its boundaries visible. Its asymmetry measurable. Its shape detached from the observer completely. The archived Earth projection shuts off automatically after the playback interval ends. The actual Milky Way remains suspended beyond the glass afterward, looking colder than before. A younger crew member seated near the side corridor asks quietly whether the galaxy still feels recognizable to anyone else. Nobody answers immediately. Not because the question is difficult, because the answer no longer seems operationally useful. Of course, it remains recognizable. The spiral morphology never disappeared. The familiar dust fractures still exist in the same places. The galactic center still glows brighter than the outer arms. The solar system still exists somewhere inside the thinner regions along one rotating edge. Recognition survived intact. Something else weakened around it. Near the lower edge of the observation glass, the oldest grease pencil marks have started fading unevenly beneath repeated cleaning cycles. Several no longer point toward anything currently visible through the windows. They remain on the glass anyway. Small physical memories of earlier positional relationships. The observation deck settles gradually quieter as the Earth recordings stop replaying. One crew member closes tired eyes briefly beneath dim lighting, while another reviews sleep rotation schedules projected faintly across a handheld display near the rear wall. Outside, the galaxy continues drifting slowly through space as a thin, luminous structure suspended beyond the ship. Still beautiful in places. Still familiar. Still containing every human city, coastline, weather system, conversation, and sleeping room the crew has ever known. But now visibly existing over there. Separated enough that the nervous system no longer mistakes recognition for return. And across the lower section of the observation glass, the fading grease pencil marks continue hovering slightly in front of the spiral structure itself, as if the ship has gradually begun trusting temporary human markings more than the emotional orientation the galaxy once provided automatically. A screwdriver rolls slowly across the maintenance deck and stops against the raised edge of a floor seam. Nobody reaches for it immediately. The ship is inside one of the quieter operational cycles now. Most major system checks finished several hours earlier. The remaining work consists mostly of inspection routines and replacement schedules that continue whether anything appears wrong or not. A crew member kneels beside an open cooling access panel near the lower observation corridor while dust drifts through the beam of a handheld inspection light. The particles move almost lazily in the recycled air before disappearing into the intake vents overhead. 3 short vibrations move through the floor. Then silence. Then the pattern again. The sound barely interrupts the room anymore. Outside the narrow observation windows beside the maintenance level, very little appears visible tonight. A few isolated concentrations remain suspended across the distance beyond the ship, but large sections of the forward view contain almost nothing bright enough for the eye to organize naturally. Nobody stands at the glass very long now during maintenance shifts. There is less to look at. Or maybe less expectation that looking will change anything. A technician removes one filter screen from the cooling assembly and taps accumulated debris into a transparent waste container. Small gray fibers collect along the bottom beside metallic dust and flakes of degraded seal material from earlier repairs. The inspection tablet clipped to the technician's wrist scrolls quietly through routine recommendations. Airflow nominal. Coolant pressure stable. Exterior thermal transfer unchanged. The procedures continue exactly the same whether the windows show crowded star fields or almost empty space beyond them. That consistency has started changing the atmosphere inside the ship. Earlier in the mission, the emptiness outside still carried emotional weight automatically. Crew members paused longer at observation ports. Silence felt heavier. The scale remained noticeable enough that ordinary routine sometimes slowed around it. Now people tighten bolts while facing the windows without looking outward at all. A woman near the rear equipment lockers wipes condensation from a storage latch using the sleeve of a thermal layer shirt. Another crew member checks vibration tolerances against an older printed maintenance chart clipped beside the wall. The ship sounds ordinary. Ventilation hum. Cooling circulation. Soft tool contact against metal housings. The occasional static pulse from communication systems deeper inside the hull. The environment outside has stopped interrupting those rhythms. A blunt operational fact settles quietly during the middle of the shift. The intergalactic medium contains matter almost everywhere. Just not enough for the nervous system to experience as environment. The realization does not arrive dramatically. Mostly through adaptation. The maintenance crew keeps moving through familiar physical routines while surrounded by abstraction large enough that it no longer emotionally registers as strange most of the time. Near one observation port, a layer of faint residue is gathered across the interior glass from repeated contact during earlier viewing cycles. Fingerprint. Cleaning streaks. The edge of an older grease pencil alignment mark nearly wiped away beneath fresh condensation. The physical traces inside the ship now feel denser than the visible universe outside it. A crew member finally picks up the screwdriver from the floor seam and returns it to a magnetic storage strip beside the open panel. The tool clicks softly into place. Then the vibrations return again. 3 short pulses. Then silence. Nobody comments on the pattern anymore either. The ship has carried the sound long enough that some crew members unconsciously pause their hand movements around it during delicate maintenance work. The body adapted before conscious attention did. That keeps happening lately. Adjustment first. Recognition later. The observation windows remain mostly dark through the maintenance cycle. One isolated external structure drifts slowly enough near the edge of visibility that it is difficult to tell whether movement is occurring at all without staring for several minutes continuously. Most people do not. A technician near the cooling assembly reseals the access panel and presses both hands briefly against the cold metal surface to confirm latch stability before standing again. The gesture looks practiced enough to happen automatically. Inside the ship, touch still verifies reality immediately. Outside, verification increasingly depends on instruments, accumulated measurements, and delayed comparison instead of direct sensation. The difference is started feeling operational instead of philosophical. A maintenance reminder appears across one side monitor. Inspect lower vibration mount during next cycle. The notification disappears after acknowledgement. No urgency attached to it. Just continuation. The crew finishes securing the remaining equipment while the ventilation system keeps circulating recycled air through the narrow maintenance corridor. Dust continues drifting through the inspection light in slow, uneven paths. Beyond the observation windows, the emptiness outside no longer feels dramatic enough to dominate attention continuously. That may be the real adaptation. Not becoming comfortable inside the void. Becoming busy enough inside ordinary routines that the void gradually stops demanding emotional response every time someone sees it. Near the end of the shift, one crew member pauses beside the observation glass long enough to notice a faint reflection staring back from the darkened window before realizing it belongs to the maintenance corridor itself. The exterior remains almost invisible beyond it. For several seconds, the reflection of the ship feels more immediate than the universe outside. Then the corridor lights dim into reduced cycle mode, and the reflection fades slowly back into the glass, while the low vibration continues moving quietly through the floor beneath everyone's feet. The navigation room remains dark except for the coordinate displays. Thin blue grids drift slowly across suspended projection panels while the ship recalculates long-range orientation against reference objects no one aboard could locate visually anymore without assistance. The room changes brightness every few seconds as different alignment layers rotate across the displays. A crew member seated near the forward console cluster slides 2 fingers across a control surface and expands one mapping sector larger against the air above the desk. The projection sharpens, then sharpens again. Still, nothing inside it resembles ordinary direction. Only abstract geometry, distance vectors, timing relationships, weak gravitational reference estimates distributed across enormous scales the eye could never organize naturally on its own. 3 short vibrations move through the floor, then silence,
sculpted by powerful wind.
then the pattern again. No one looks up from the displays. The navigation systems still function correctly. That fact appears repeatedly throughout the room in quiet procedural language scrolling across side monitors. Reference continuity stable. Orientation confidence acceptable. Drift compensation synchronized. The ship often knows where it is before the crew emotionally understands the answer themselves. A technician near the rear console wall removes an older calibration card from a storage sleeve and compares it against one of the rotating projection grids. The card looks almost primitive beside the live navigation displays. Printed coordinates. Manual correction sequences. Handwritten annotations near the margins from earlier transit phases. Yet people still check them. Not because the computers fail often. Because abstraction eventually becomes difficult to trust emotionally unless something physical still touches it. The room sounds softer than it used to. Cooling systems. Low electrical hum. Occasional confirmation tones. The faint scratching noise of someone writing recalibration notes across a printed maintenance sheet. Most conversations now remain procedural and brief. A crew member asks whether the orientation drift near one external reference cluster exceeds tolerance range. Another answers without looking away from the display. Not yet. The exchange ends there. Outside the navigation room, Almost nothing visible remains through the narrow observation ports along this deck level. The windows show scattered concentrations too sparse to organize into intuitive structure. The actual exterior universe has become less readable than the artificial models floating inside the room.
That reversal happened gradually.
Earlier in the mission, navigation systems existed mainly to refine orientation already emotionally understood through direct observation. The stars still behaved enough like environment for the nervous system to participate naturally. Now the systems generate orientation almost entirely alone. The human mind mostly confirms outputs afterward. A projection near the center of the room rotates slowly into another mapping layer. Several external structures disappear from the display during simplification filtering, while the navigation model prioritizes stronger references farther outward. Nobody reacts visibly when the structures vanish. The abstraction already changes constantly now. Points appear. Reconnect. Reclassify. Fade. The systems still maintain continuity through all of it. Human intuition does not. A realization arrives during the middle of an otherwise ordinary recalibration cycle. The maps no longer represent reality. The maps replace it.
The thought settles quietly.
A crew member near the side consoles opens an archived orientation recording from earlier transit years. The older display model appears simpler immediately. Denser references. Shorter correction chains. More visual overlap between the displayed coordinates and the actual visible sky outside the ship at the time. Someone watches the playback for less than a minute before closing it again.
The current displays return.
Layered abstractions rotating through dark air above the consoles. The ship continues relying on relationships no human nervous system evolved to interpret directly. Near the rear wall, a maintenance worker wipes condensation from the edge of one inactive display housing using the cloth already damp from repeated use. Another technician reseats a loose connector cable beneath the lower console bank while verification tones continue sounding quietly overhead. Inside the room, touch still matters. Pressure against controls. Cold metal surfaces. Paper edges. Manual switches. Outside the room, position itself has become almost entirely symbolic. One of the projection grids briefly destabilizes during synchronization. The coordinate lines bend slightly across the display before realigning again several seconds later. Nobody panics.
The systems correct automatically.
Still, several crew members instinctively glance toward the same display at once. The reaction happens before conscious interpretation. The body still searches for stable orientation cues even after years inside abstraction.
A procedural alert scrolls across one side monitor.
Manual confirmation recommended after secondary reference compression. A crew member acknowledges the notice and begins comparing positional estimates manually against the printed calibration sheet from earlier. The process takes several minutes. Numbers. Exports. Timing corrections. The ship drifts silently onward while the crew rebuilds confidence through repeated symbolic agreement rather than direct environmental understanding. The navigation room grows quieter as the recalibration cycle continues. Some displays dim automatically once alignment thresholds stabilize. Others remain active, projecting rotating coordinate structures across the ceiling and floor in faint moving light. The projections reflect weakly against nearby faces now. Grid lines passing across skin, across coffee containers, across folded maintenance gloves resting near the edge of one console. Human beings sitting physically inside systems they no longer independently comprehend. The realization does not feel dramatic anymore either. Mostly tiring. A younger crew member finally asks whether anyone aboard could still determine the ship's position without the navigation systems remaining active. Nobody answers immediately. Not because the answer is uncertain, because everyone already knows it. The room continues operating around the silence. Cooling fans cycle. Displays rotate. Verification tones repeat. 3 short vibrations move upward through the floor again. Then silence. Eventually, one navigation officer responds while still watching the projection grids drift across the room. Not accurately enough. The answer sounds procedural, almost gentle. Then the recalibration sequence finishes. Several projection layers disappear simultaneously, leaving only the primary orientation framework suspended above the central consoles. The simplified model looks cleaner afterward. Less crowded, less visually exhausting, and somehow even harder to emotionally interpret than before. The navigation room settles back into ordinary operational silence while the remaining coordinate overlays drift slowly through the dim air, describing a location the ship still technically understands, even as human intuition continues fading farther behind the abstractions required to maintain it. The observation chamber lights remain dimmed low enough that the console indicators reflect faintly across the glass. Green status lights. A weak amber alignment marker near the lower wall. The soft pulse of one inactive monitor still running background diagnostics even though nobody has touched it in several hours. A crew member sits alone near the forward observation rail with both hands wrapped around a warm drink container that stopped producing visible steam long ago. The container remains there anyway. Outside the glass, several distant galaxies remain visible through the long-range magnification field. Not dramatically bright. Not especially large. Just present. One elongated cluster drifts slowly near the upper edge of the viewing frame while 2 smaller concentrations remain suspended lower and farther outward across the observation field. Their motion is almost impossible to perceive directly. The ship continues rotating beneath them. The galaxies continue rotating within themselves. The eye experiences neither movement naturally anymore. 3 short vibrations move through the floor. Then silence. Then the pattern again. No one reacts. The observation chamber no longer carries the same emotional pressure it once did earlier in the mission. Crew members still spend scheduled orientation periods here, but the behavior has changed. People rarely stand close against the glass now. Most remain seated. Some review maintenance schedules or sleep reports while the galaxies drift overhead unnoticed for long intervals at a time. The structures remain beautiful. That condition survived. The brighter cores still soften outward into faint surrounding halos. Thin, asymmetrical distortions remain visible along the outer edges, where gravitational interactions stretch entire stellar systems slowly across millions of years. Some clusters appear denser near one side than the other. The details remain physically extraordinary. The nervous system no longer automatically converts that visibility into emotional connection. A woman near the rear wall adjusts the sleeve of a thermal layer shirt while reading old weather notes stored inside a personal archive display. Light rain after midnight. Street flooding near the station entrance. Wind stronger near the river this week. The observations remain small enough to feel immediately inhabitable. Outside the ship, entire galactic systems drift through visibility without producing the same feeling. That difference settles quietly. A navigation overlay appears briefly across the observation glass during automatic orientation maintenance. Small labels attach themselves to the visible galaxies one by one. Cluster designation. Estimated mass distribution.
Relative motion confidence acceptable. Then the overlay fades again. The galaxies remain behind it, unchanged by identification. A crew member seated near the forward rail finally looks up from a maintenance report and watches one distant galactic cluster for almost a full minute without moving. Nothing emotionally sharp arrives. No awe. No fear. No longing. Only observation continuing. The adaptation feels complete enough now that the absence itself becomes noticeable. Earlier in the mission, distance still intensified emotional response automatically. The larger the visible scale became, the more heavily perception reacted against it. Now scale persists without increasing psychological intensity at all. The galaxies remain physically enormous. Emotionally, they drift closer to weather patterns viewed through distant windows. Present. Visible. Not personally relational. The room grows quieter as another reduced cycle lighting transition begins. Several console indicators dim automatically. The electrical hum beneath the floor becomes easier to hear afterward. Someone near the side corridor unwraps compressed meal packaging slowly enough that the sound briefly interrupts the chamber more than the galaxies outside it. Plastic folding. Metal touching the seat frame. Fabric shifting against restraints. Inside the ship, small physical sounds still organize attention more reliably than intergalactic structure. A realization arrives late. Observation does not guarantee attachment. The thought disappears almost immediately back into environmental silence. Outside the observation glass, one isolated galaxy near the lower edge of the frame rotates far enough during the ship's orientation drift that its visible shape changes slightly across the magnification field. The elongated halo becomes narrower. The brighter central region sharpens for several seconds. A crew member notices, then returns to reviewing a sleep cycle report without commenting on it. The galaxies have gradually stopped behaving like revelations. They now behave more like conditions. A maintenance worker enters the observation chamber carrying replacement filter mesh beneath one arm and pauses near the rear equipment wall while waiting for an access panel diagnostic to finish cycling. Dust drifts briefly through the inspection light clipped beside the toolkit before disappearing into the ventilation current overhead. The worker never looks out the glass. That would have felt impossible earlier in the mission. Now it barely stands out. A dim console near the forward rail refreshes automatically with updated cluster orientation data. The display shifts several galactic reference points by fractions of a degree relative to the ship's current position. No visible change accompanies the correction. The galaxies remain almost exactly where they appeared before. Human perception has started losing sensitivity to gradual cosmic motion entirely. Not because movement stopped. Because the scales involved no longer generate enough immediate contrast for biological timing to hold on to continuously. The chamber settles into another long interval of low activity. Electrical hum. Ventilation pressure. 3 short vibrations beneath the floor. Then silence again. The galaxies remain suspended beyond the observation glass while the crew moves quietly through ordinary human maintenance behaviors underneath them. Drinking cooled coffee. Adjusting sleeves. Reviewing reports. Cleaning moisture from the lower window seals. One crew member near the forward rail eventually closes tired eyes for several seconds while the distant clusters continue drifting slowly across the glass beyond the dim reflections of the room itself. When the eyes open again, the galaxies remain beautiful. Still visible. Still structurally magnificent. but no longer emotionally larger than the warm drink container resting quietly between both hands beneath the low electrical hum of the ship. The recalibration timer reaches 0 without any audible notification. One by one, the navigation displays begin refreshing across the darkened room. Thin directional grids drift slowly over the suspended projection panels while the ship aligns itself against another extragalactic reference sequence, too large for direct human orientation to follow naturally anymore. Nobody speaks during the first part of the process. A crew member seated near the center console rotates a worn pen slowly between two fingers while watching the alignment overlay stabilize across the displays. Another compares timing values against an older printed correction sheet resting beside a cooled coffee container near the edge of the console. 3 short vibrations move upward through the floor. Then silence. Then the pattern again. The recalibration sequence has become familiar enough now that most of the crew barely watches the displays continuously while it runs. The systems usually correct themselves cleanly. Minor drift adjustments appear, fade, recalculate, then disappear again beneath stable orientation confirmation markers. Outside the narrow observation ports along the navigation deck, the visible galaxies remain scattered across enormous separation distances with almost no emotional hierarchy between them anymore. One direction no longer feels meaningfully different from another. That realization arrived slowly. Earlier in the mission, even after the Milky Way became visibly detached from the ship, part of the nervous system still treated its position differently from the surrounding universe. The galaxy continued functioning as reference beyond mathematics. Homeward orientation still carried weight. Now the navigation systems label galactic directions the same way they label every other structure. Reference cluster. Relative motion. Rotational offset. The procedural language flattened the symbolism gradually until the distinction weakened almost completely. A technician near the rear wall wipes condensation from the lower edge of one inactive monitor, while the primary recalibration grid continues drifting across the room. The cloth leaves temporary streaks visible beneath the blue projection light before drying again several seconds later. The room sounds ordinary. Electrical hum. Cooling circulation. Soft page movement from printed calibration sheets. Someone swallowing cooled coffee near the side consoles. The final major recalibration cycle proceeds without tension. That may be the wrong part. A navigation overlay briefly expands across the largest central display, connecting several visible galactic reference systems through faint trajectory lines extending far beyond the boundaries of the room itself. One line points toward the Milky Way. Another toward neighboring clusters now closer to the ship's projected future position than the galaxy behind it. The system displays both with identical visual weight. No distinction remains inside the model. A younger crew member studies the projection quietly for several seconds before asking which directional vector still corresponds most closely to Earth. The answer arrives immediately from another station. Port aft. 2 degrees below current reference plane. The response sounds operational. Nothing more. No one looks toward the observation ports afterward. That behavior changes the room slightly. The coordinates still exist. The direction still functions mathematically. But the orientation itself no longer produces emotional correction inside the people hearing it. Earth now occupies a usable vector instead of a psychological center. The recalibration grids continue moving slowly across nearby surfaces. Thin lines drift over hands resting against consoles, across maintenance gloves left folded near the side wall, across a paper cup someone forgot to remove from the previous shift cycle. The projection systems continue treating all directions equally. Eventually, the crew begins doing the same. A realization appears quietly during one of the longer synchronization pauses. Direction survives longer than relationship does. The thought settles into the room without interruption. Near the lower observation port, one of the oldest grease pencil markings still remains faintly visible against the glass. The mark originally tracked the Milky Way during earlier transit periods, when crew members still measured orientation changes manually against visible galactic movement. Now the galaxy itself sits outside the current observation angle entirely. The mark remains anyway, pointing toward empty space beyond the edge of the window. A crew member notices it while reviewing orientation outputs and pauses briefly before wiping part of the old line away using the side of a sleeve. Not all of it. Just enough to blur the original direction. The recalibration sequence reaches final synchronization several minutes later. Most of the projection layers disappear simultaneously, leaving only a simplified directional framework suspended above the central consoles. The remaining overlay looks almost empty compared to earlier navigation cycles. A few stable reference vectors, minimal trajectory guidance. One faint directional indicator still labeling the galactic position behind the ship. The systems no longer require more detail than that. Neither do the crew. Outside the observation ports, scattered galaxies remain suspended through the darkness without obvious relational order. Some technically lie closer now than the structures that once emotionally defined orientation earlier in the mission. The nervous system stopped resisting that fact somewhere along the way. A maintenance reminder scrolls briefly across one inactive side monitor. Archive outdated directional overlays after current cycle. The message disappears after acknowledgement. No one comments on it. The room settles back into low operational silence while the simplified navigation grid continues drifting slowly through the dim air above the consoles. The remaining directional marker pointing toward the Milky Way grows fainter during automatic brightness reduction until it almost disappears completely against the darkened display. Still technically present. Still accurate. No longer useful for anything except orientation. The observation glass remains completely still for so long that the eye begins searching for flaws inside it. A faint cleaning streak near the lower corner. Small condensation marks gathering beside the seal along the forward rail. One thin scratch visible only when the chamber lights dim far enough for the reflections to soften. Beyond the glass, several galaxies remain suspended across the distance without obvious movement between them. A crew member sits alone near the center observation seat with both shoes half unlaced and a folded thermal blanket resting across one knee. The blanket slides slowly downward every few minutes before being adjusted again without attention. 3 short vibrations move through the floor. Then silence. Then the pattern again. The sound remains faint enough now that it no longer interrupts thought. The observation chamber lighting stays low during most cycles. Only the emergency pathway strips and a few inactive console indicators continue glowing steadily along the walls. The rest of the room drifts between shadow and reflected galactic light, depending on the ship's orientation. No one uses the magnification displays very often anymore. The distant galaxies remain visible enough without enlargement now. Not detailed, just structurally present. One elongated spiral sits higher than the others near the upper edge of the glass. Another appears almost circular from this angle, its brighter center surrounded by a diffuse outer halo that fades gradually into the surrounding blackness. Farther outward, smaller concentrations remain scattered across distances too large for emotional comparison to function naturally. The room stays quiet long enough for the ventilation system to separate into recognizable layers. Air passing through overhead intake grills. A lower electrical vibration beneath the floor.
soft cooling circulation somewhere inside the wall behind the observation seats.
The ship still sounds inhabited.
Outside the glass, habitation no longer feels visually implied by anything. A crew member near the rear wall slowly wipes moisture from the edge of an inactive display using the corner of a sleeve. The screen remains dark after cleaning. No one powers it back on. Most of the navigation overlays stayed disabled during observation cycles now. The crew no longer needs constant directional reinforcement. Or maybe there is less difference between directions than there used to be. The galaxies remain visible either way. A blunt operational statement appears briefly across one dim side monitor before fading back into standby mode. External structural visibility unchanged. The message feels almost unnecessary. Nothing outside has visibly changed in several cycles. That condition no longer produces frustration the way it once did earlier in the mission. The nervous system adapted, eventually. People stopped expecting the universe to provide emotional feedback proportional to the distances being crossed. Now the chamber mostly contains maintenance behavior. Someone adjusting a restraint strap. Someone drinking cooled coffee. Someone checking the seam along the lower observation rail for condensation buildup. The galaxies remain suspended beyond all of it, like stable weather patterns no one discusses anymore. The crew member seated near the glass finally lifts one hand and places two fingers lightly against the observation surface. Not searching for warmth. Just contact. The glass remains cold. Beyond it, one faint galactic cluster drifts slowly enough near the edge of the frame that its motion only becomes visible after comparing it against a grease pencil alignment mark still remaining from earlier transit periods. The mark itself has almost disappeared now. Repeated cleaning cycles reduced it into a thin, uneven blur near the lower section of the glass. The galaxy remains easier to see than the directions someone once used to track it. That realization settles quietly into the room. The observation chamber grows still again afterward. No archived Earth recordings play anymore during these shifts. No one restarts the weather files or the old street noise recordings from earlier transit years. The room no longer seems to require them for orientation. Or perhaps there is nothing left to compare them against meaningfully. A maintenance worker enters briefly carrying replacement airflow mesh beneath one arm and pauses near the rear equipment panel while waiting for a diagnostic lock to disengage. Dust drifts through the inspection light attached to the toolkit before disappearing upward into the ventilation current. The worker never looks toward the galaxies. The moment passes without significance. Then the panel opens. The airflow mesh gets replaced. The worker leaves again. The galaxies remain where they were before. The observation chamber continues existing inside the same slow physical conditions. Low electrical vibration. Filtered air. Cold glass. Distant structures suspended beyond relational scale. A younger crew member eventually asks whether the ship still technically faces away from the Milky Way during the current orientation cycle. Another person checks a nearby display. Mostly. The answer arrives softly. Then nothing follows it. No one turns to look for the galaxy itself. The direction still exists mathematically. That seems sufficient now. Outside the glass, one of the distant spirals becomes briefly clearer as the ship rotates several degrees through a minor stabilization adjustment. The brighter central region sharpens. A faint asymmetry appears along one outer edge where gravitational distortion stretches part of the structure outward into a thinner arc. The detail remains visible for less than a minute before the angle changes again. Nobody comments on it. Earlier in the mission, the room would have reacted differently. Someone would have called another crew member over. The magnification systems might have activated automatically. The site itself would have briefly reorganized attention.
Now observation continues without emotional redistribution. Beauty survived. Centrality did not. The chamber lighting dims slightly lower during the artificial night transition. Reflections spread farther across the observation glass afterward. For several seconds, the galaxies become partially hidden behind faint mirrored images of the room itself. Empty seats. A folded blanket. The dim pulse of one inactive console. A hand resting quietly against cold glass. Then the reflections soften again as the ship rotates. The galaxies return fully into view. Still visible. Still structurally immense. Still existing across the observation window exactly as they did before human beings learned to attach meaning to orientation inside them. The crew remained seated beneath the low electrical hum of the ship while the scattered galactic systems continued drifting almost imperceptibly beyond the glass, separated by distances too large to feel empty anymore and too stable to feel unfamiliar.